Hello friends, welcome to CEC Gurukul live lectures. Dear friends, in this session we are going to continue further in our series on principles of ecology. We are going to talk on nutrients and biogeochemical cycles in detail, and for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Charu Dogra Rawat. Dr. Charu Dogra Rawat is Assistant Professor in Department of Zoology, Ramjas College, University of Delhi. Dr. Charu Dogra Rawat is a prolific professor, and she continuously persistently makes efforts so that the students are benefited through her knowledge. Friends, if you have any question while listening to us, feel free to talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Charu Dogra Rawat, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. So continuing with the ecosystem, we have already talked about the ecosystem energetics, in which we saw how the energy flows into an ecosystem. That brings us to a point where we need to discuss about the cycling of various other materials such as the different and essential nutrients. So in this topic today, we'll cover the nutrient and biogeochemical cycles, in which we will understand the mechanism, how this cycling happens, and in detail we will study about the nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur cycles in nature. The reference for this session is from Odum EP Fundamentals of Ecology book, and it is used only for the educational purpose, and anything other than that is always referenced. So the biogeochemical cycles, if we see, then the elements in the nature are almost never homogeneously distributed, nor are they present in the same chemical form throughout the ecosystem. And this heterogeneity leads to the circulation of these materials. Chemical elements, including all the essential elements of life, tend to circulate in the biosphere in characteristic pathways from the environment to organisms and then back to the environment. And these are termed as, therefore, the biogeochemical cycle. So bio is living, geo is the earth or the atmosphere, and the cycle is because it keeps on moving from the environment to the organisms and back to the environment. Unlike the energy which we saw that moves from one trophic level to the other trophic level in a unidirectional manner or in a multi-directional, but it never comes back to the same trophic level. It's not cyclic. The movement of these elements and inorganic compounds that are essential to life is designated as the nutrient cycling. Now, each nutrient cycle generally can be divided into two compartments or pools. One is termed as the reservoir pool, which is the large, slow-moving, generally non-biological component, and the labile or cycling pool, a smaller but more active proportion that is exchanging rapidly between the organisms and their immediate environment. So these two pools can be compartmentalized in each nutrient cycle. Now, it's important to note here that this reservoir pool is sometimes said to be the unavailable pool, and the labile or the cyclic pool is said to be the available pool. But the non-available or availability basically is a relative term used here. The energy, the cycling of the materials from the reservoir pool only takes place, but it is the bulk one. It is the larger one. It's the slow-moving one. So this is a diagram in which this nutrient cycling is superimposed upon the universal energy flow diagram which we saw. So you can see that here this was the trophic levels, different trophic levels. So this is the autotrophic, this is the heterotrophic system, and you can see that this is the passing of the energy from this level, the absorbed light, and then dissipation of energy used into respiration, produced and then passed on from the next generation. This black circle represents the cyclic of the nutrients. Now, this black box is the reservoir pool, and as I said, sometimes termed as the unavailable pool. It is indicated by this, the nutrient pool, which it says. The cyclic portion, as you can see, which is also called as the available or the exchange pool, is designated by the circle going from the autotrophs to the heterotrophs and to the back again. So, autotrophs to heterotrophs and as well as into the environment is basically constituting this circle. So, basic types of biogeochemical cycles, if we look at in an ecosphere as a whole, the cycles fall into two basic groups. One is the gaseous types, in which the reservoir is in the atmosphere or the hydrosphere or the ocean, and the sedimentary types, in which the reservoir is in the crust of the earth. So, as I said, we will look into some major nutrient cycling today, and you will see that for some of the nutrients, the major source, the major pool is the atmosphere. It can be in the air or the oceans, but for some of the things it will be in the earth's crust. However, it is again important to note the energy in some form must be expended to recycle the materials, and that's why the energy movement as well as the nutrient cycling goes hand in hand. When the nutrients are passed on from one to another, and when it goes to the environment, it has to be at the expense of the energy. When it is fixed into the organisms or it comes to the biotic system, then also some energy needs to be expensed so that this can happen. So nutrient cycle cannot work in isolation, but the energy needs to be spent for the nutrients to be circulated in the ecosystem. We will look at the 5 examples. However, in today's session we will be able to cover the 3. First is the nitrogen cycle, which is a very complex, well buffered and a gaseous type of cycle. We will look at the phosphorus cycle, which is a simpler, less well buffered, regulated, sedimentary type cycle. So you can see this is gaseous cycle because the reservoir pool of nitrogen will be in the atmosphere. This is a sedimentary type of cycle because the reservoir pool of the phosphorus cycle is in the sediments or in the earth's crust. So this is a sedimentary type of cycle. And the sulfur cycle, to illustrate 3 things basically, we will take up this cycle. One is the link between the air, water and the current and the crust of the earth, because the active circulation within and between these pools occur. So sulfur, we will see that it is circulated between all the 3 phases, and therefore the active circulation occurs. Second point why we will take sulfur cycle is because the key role played by the microorganisms. So we will look at how the microorganisms are playing a role in a nutrient cycle, and we will also look at the complications which are caused by the industrial and air pollution. So we will also understand how man-made activities etc. impact these nutrient cycling. So for that we will take up the sulfur cycle as an example. And of course, carbon cycle and hydrologic cycle, which we will take in our subsequent lectures, are crucial to life and are being increasingly affected again by the human activities. So we will study in detail about these 2 cycles also. Another important term which needs to be considered is called as the footprint or the region of influence. This is basically the boundaries of an ecosystem. So when we talk about the nutrient or biogeochemical cycling, we need to understand the concept of these boundaries. Now, these boundaries can be natural, these boundaries can be man-made or made by the ecologists for the purpose of studying and modeling. But when we are talking about this cycling, although we are taking a larger perspective of the entire ecosystem, but we also need to understand that where these nutrients cannot be passed, or what are the barriers, what are the boundaries, or what are the footprints or the regions of influence for these nutrients to be cycled in an ecosystem. So that concept also we will just briefly introduce for a better understanding. So talking about the cycling of the nitrogen or the nitrogen cycle. Now everything that lives needs nitrogen. But most atoms of nitrogen, which represent 78% of the atmosphere, are bound tightly in pairs at nitrogen, as N2, and it has a triple bond in between them. So most of the 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but this nitrogen is not available to the organisms because it contains this N3, triple bond between 2 nitrogen molecules. However, as I said, in human beings, for example, all the DNA, RNA, all the genetic material, many amino acids, they all need nitrogen as the building block. All the nucleotides, they constitute nitrogen. So nitrogen is very important for all the materials which is there, and everything basically needs this nitrogen molecules. Most organisms, as I said, can't break this powerful triple bond of the N2 molecules or 2 atoms. Now, for plants to grow and animals to thrive, they need the nitrogen element in a reactive fixed form that is bonded to carbon, hydrogen, or either oxygen, most often as organic nitrogen compounds such as amino acids, ammonium, or nitrate. So, the atmospheric nitrogen, as I said, because this is a gaseous nutrient cycling, the reservoir pool is the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So, this reservoir pool, nitrogen pool, it's a large pool, but very less amount of nitrogen can be available, because for growth, whatever plants and animals need, they cannot break this element. They need this element in association with carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen, and these forms are basically such as ammonia, ammonium, and amino acids, or in nitrate form. So, they can only take nitrogen in these kind of forms. Animals get their reactive nitrogen from eating plants and other animals somewhere along the food chain, and plants get reactive nitrogen from the soil or water. Now, from the atmosphere, the nitrogen needs to enter the ecosystem. When it needs to enter the biotic part of the ecosystem, that is the plants and the animals, as I said, it needs to be converted into the forms which are which are usable, the usable forms. So, the one thing is that this atmospheric nitrogen is fixed in some parts by physical factors such as the lightning. So, lightning converts this atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen trioxide, and this nitrogen trioxide is then brought down by the rain, snow, and hail into the soil. And these plants can take up the soil, can take up the nitrogen from the soil or water where it is lying. So, we will look at that how it can take these molecules and construct the protoplasm by the synthesis of protoplasm, such as the proteins and the nucleic acids, where it is majorly required. These plants somewhere down the food chain are eaten up by animals, and therefore this nitrogen is made available to the animal, and then animals use them to synthesize their protoplasm, the proteins, the nucleic acids, etc. So, this is just a part of the nitrogen. I will go through the nitrogen cycle slowly, part by part. So, one of the mechanisms by which the atmospheric nitrogen can enter the ecosystem, or the biological system, basically part of the ecosystem, is through this route, where the lightning, etc., can convert it into certain molecules that can be absorbed by the plants through the soil and water where they are washed into, and then the animals, when eat the plants, it comes into them. This is actually replenished by the fossil fuel burning also, where the nitrogen, dinitrogen oxide is produced, which then convert into nitrogen trioxide. So, this is the industrialization process. Everything is happening at the expense. So, when it needs to be returned here, it needs the expense of energy. So, fossil fuels need to be burnt for returning this nitrogen into the atmosphere. The propulsion of nitrogen from here further down into the cycle is by the protoplasm. Whatever energy they expend during the synthesis of the protoplasm, that is how the nitrogen is moving from one phase to another. So, that's how these are some of the physical factors that replenishes the nitrogen back into the atmosphere, or the nitrogen enters into the biotic system. These are some of the factors which are there. Most naturally occurring reactive nitrogen comes from the nitrogen fixation by bacteria, including the cyanobacteria, and specialized bacteria such as those we will see, for example, the genera Rhizobium, which most often live symbiotically in plants such as peas, beans, and alfalfa. So, apart from the physical fixation or the physical factors which leads to the nitrogen coming into the biotic part of the ecosystem, there are certain bacteria which are there. Most of them are prokaryotic. They are all bacteria. For example, Rhizobium, the Azotobacter, the Cyanobacteria, Clostridium is an anaerobic bacteria. Later on, certain bacteria such as Rhodospirillum, Pseudomonas like soil bacteria, and the filamentous Actinomycetes were also found to have the ability of nitrogen fixation. They have the ability to fix this atmospheric nitrogen, and convert it into molecules such as ammonia. Now this ammonia, as I said, can be metabolized further by the different microorganisms or the living organisms. They cannot take up directly the atmospheric nitrogen. So this nitrogen fixation bacteria plays an important role. These nitrogen fixation, however, they prefer to do it in the anaerobic. Nitrogen fixation is affected by the presence of oxygen. It's actually inversely relation. There is an inverse relation. So if there is more of oxygen, but some of these organisms are also aerobic. So they need to balance, because they need to balance so that their nitrogen fixation ability is not affected by their aerobic respiration. So they do photosynthesize, they do live aerobically, but they limit the availability of oxygen for the purpose of nitrogen fixation. So they have to create that kind of a balance which is there. And for that, some of the organisms, they occur as heterocysts. So some of the organisms, as we will see, occur in the root nodules, because that gives a sustainable environment. That gives a very, anaerobic kind of an environment, particularly for the fixation of the nitrogen. So this nitrogen fixation bacteria can be of several types. This is an example. This is a picture shown here for the nitrogen fixing nodules on a clover plant root. So this is a root, and the arrows shows the nodules where the bacteria reside. And this bacteria can fix the nitrogen into the soil, and then so this is kind of a mutualistic relationship. The bacteria derive the food and water from the roots, and the plants in turn gets the atmospheric nitrogen, which they cannot absorb by themselves. So it's kind of a symbiosis. It's a beneficial relationship for the two, the roots as well as the plants as well as the organisms staying in the root nodules. Now looking at the chemical reaction for this nitrogen fixation, you can see that there are 8 electrons at least and 16 ATP molecules which are required to convert the atmospheric nitrogen. As I said, the energy needs to be expensed because the triple bond between the two nitrogen molecules need to be broken. So these molecules, energy hydrolysis breaks down this nitrogen and converts it into ammonia and chemical reaction. So the whole process requires 8 electrons and at least 16 ATP molecules. For biofixation of legume nodule bacteria, like we have just seen, some 10 gram of glucose, which is about 40 kilocalories of energy from plant photosynthate is required to fix the 1 gram of nitrogen. For non-leguminous and free living nitrogen fixing bacteria, this ratio is much more. They require some like 100 grams of glucose to fix 1 gram of nitrogen. And for physical factors also, the fossil fuels need to be burned. If industrial fixation we look at, for example, the synthesis of nitrogen biofertilizers. So the synthesis of nitrogen fertilizers, for this synthesis of nitrogen, for the fixation of nitrogen by industries, the fossil fuels need to be burnt. So the energy need to be spent. So a lot of energy is required for the nitrogen to be fixed into the introduced into the ecosystem for circulation. These are some of the representative prokaryotes known to carry out nitrogen fixation. As we can see, these are the cyanobacteria, the nostoc and the anabina. These are the free living aerobic phototrophic bacteria. Then we also have Pseudomonas, Azotobacter, Methylomonas. These are also free living aerobic. These are chemoorganotrophic bacteria. So chemoorganotrophic bacteria basically means that they require the breakdown of certain other nutrients, such as the chemical breakdown for this thing to happen. For example, they need the carbon to be broken down so that the energy can be generated for fixing this kind of materials. So alkalogens and thiobacillus bacteria, they are free living aerobic and again chemolithotrophic. Then there are other Methanococcus. These are some archaea bacteria which are anaerobic bacteria that can also fix nitrogen. These are archaea. Then there are chlorobium bacteria, there are D-sulfovibrio and Clostridium. As I said, Clostridium is an anaerobic free living chemoorganotrophic. Rhizobium, etc., they live in the root nodule, so they have a symbiotic association. They are aerobic and they are also chemoorganotrophic bacteria. So these are some of the representative prokaryotes that are known to carry out the nitrogen fixation. So apart from the bacteria and the cyanobacteria, there are some genera from the archaea that has been found to fix nitrogen. Now, despite their physical diversity and different physiology, the similar enzyme complexes which are called as nitrogenase are found in these organisms that catalyze the reduction of the nitrogen to ammonia, which can be used as a genetic marker to identify the potential for nitrogen fixation. So these nitrogenase are common. The enzyme nitrogenase is present in all the organisms that can fix nitrogen. Therefore, it can be used as a marker also. Genes for nitrogenase are globally distributed and have been found in many aerobic habitats, for example, oceans, lakes, soils, and also in habitats that may be anaerobic or microaerophilic, for example, termite guts, sediments, hypersaline lakes, microbial mats, planktonic crustaceans. So, there's a whole distribution of the presence of this global presence of these genes for nitrogenase is there. The broad distribution of nitrogen fixing genes suggests that nitrogen fixing organisms display a very broad range of environmental conditions, as might be expected for a process that is so critical to the survival of all life on the earth. So I started this nitrogen cycling with a statement that everything needs a nitrogen. So because this is so crucial, so you can see that this nitrogen fixing in genes are very widely distributed and they can be found in all the strata of living forms. Mostly prokaryotic fixation is there, but they are whole distributed because they are very important for the survival of life on the earth. Moving further, we have just seen this part, the physical factors. We have seen this part where the nitrogen fixation is done by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, this ammonia can then be converted into nitrites and nitrates, further molecules, and this process is done called as the nitrification and performed by various nitrifying bacteria. So these nitrates are the ones, where they can be recycled back into the environment. Therefore, for the conversion of ammonium into nitrites and nitrates, we have this specialized bacteria which are called as the nitrifying bacteria. Now, nitrification is the process that converts ammonia to nitrite and then to nitrate. Two distinct steps of nitrification that are carried out by different types of microorganisms. The first step is the oxidation of the ammonia to nitrite, which is carried out by microbes known as the ammonia oxidizers. It is a two-step chemical reaction. The reaction 1 converts ammonia to an intermediate which is called as hydroxylamine and is catalyzed by the enzyme ammonia monooxygenase. Reaction 2 then converts this intermediate hydroxylamine to nitrite, and this is catalyzed by the enzyme hydroxylamine oxidoreductase. So these two enzymes are essential for the conversion of the ammonia into nitrites. And this nitrite converting bacteria are called as ammonia oxidizers. So certain specialized bacteria has the presence of both these enzymes where the ammonia is converted into an intermediate and then intermediate is finally converted into a nitrite. The second step is then the nitrification, is the oxidation of this nitrite to nitrate, which is carried out by nitrite oxidizing bacteria. So the chemical reaction is when the half oxygen molecule adds on to the nitrite to give a nitrate which is there. Some of the genera which are involved in ammonia oxidation include Nitrosomonas, Nitrospira and Nitrosococcus. So they have both the enzymes, the hydroxylamine oxidoreductase and ammonia monooxygenase. So they contain both these enzymes for the conversion of the ammonia into the nitrite. And some of the genera that includes this nitrite oxidizing bacteria are such as Nitrospira, Nitrobacter, Nitrococcus and Nitrospina. So they contain these oxidation enzyme that converts the nitrite into nitrate. So this entire process is termed as the nitrification and constitutes an important part of the nitrogen cycle. Then comes returning this nitrates into the environment. And this is done by what is called as the denitrification. And again, we have specialized microorganisms for that. This nitrates can be, again formed by burning of the fossil fuels if they just erode. So as we saw, the burning of the fossil fuels is also returning this nitrogen, and this nitrates can also be formed by the erosion of these fossil fuels, and the nitrates can be generated. So cyclic movement of these nitrates back into the atmosphere or back into the products that can again be cycled into the nitrogen cycle is done by the denitrifying bacteria. Denitrification is the process that converts nitrate to nitrogen gas, thus removing bioavailable nitrogen and returning it to the atmosphere. So in this way, the nitrite is converted first into nitrous oxide or N2O, and then finally converted into the nitrogen. The reactions involved, so reaction 1 represents the steps of the reducing nitrate to dinitrogen gas, and reaction 2 represents the complete redox reaction of the denitrification. So this is the complete denitrification reaction. It's again a composite of 2 reactions, and the nitrogen, actually this was supposed to be here, so it just returns to the atmosphere nitrogen. So the denitrifying bacteria has the ability to do that. Unlike nitrification, however, denitrification is an anaerobic process occurring mostly in soils and sediments and anoxic zones in lakes and oceans. So nitrifying bacteria, as we said, is also, there were 2 types. They were anaerobic as well as aerobic. The process of nitrogen fixation was anaerobic. However, the bacteria could be aerobic. Basically, the oxygen is detrimental for the nitrogen fixation or conversion into nitrites and nitrates. But denitrification is essentially an anaerobic process, and it occurs mostly in soils and sediments and anoxic zones in lakes and oceans. Some denitrifying bacteria include the species in the genera Bacillus, Paracoccus and Pseudomonas. Denitrifiers are again chemoorganotrophs and thus must also be supplied with some form of organic carbon. So chemoorganotrophs are the ones which needs the chemical energy for the conversion of these nitrogen forms, and this chemical energy needs to come from some carbon source, some organic carbon. There are certain phototrophs also which uses the sun energy to convert these nitrogen forms, but denitrifiers are strictly chemoorganotrophs and they require the energy at the expense of the certain organic molecules, organic carbon molecules which are there. This denitrification is very important in that it removes the fixed nitrogen from the ecosystem and returns it to the atmosphere in a biologically inert form. As I said, because this is a nutrient cycling we are talking about, so whatever is coming into the ecosystem needs to go back into the atmosphere also. So whatever comes to the biological component needs to go back. However, this cycle, our day to day, because of the human activities becoming less cyclic, we are introducing a lot of chemical fertilizers, we are introducing a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil. So it is becoming much more than what denitrifying bacteria can actually return to the atmosphere. And therefore the nitrogen fixing bacteria, as we will see that too much of nitrogen is detrimental for the growth. So again this cycling is done to emphasize on the fact that how human activities are also impacting these cycles and why they are so important to be restored in a normal cyclic form. So after this denitrification bacteria, we see that there is also a small cycle going on here. We missed this part. So this part is what is called as the ammonification. So the plants and animal, apart from fixing the nitrogen into their protoplasm, when they die, they just decomposer organisms feed on them, and it comes to their protoplasm, and they have the tendency to convert this into ammonia. So this process is termed as the ammonification. So when an organism excretes waste or dies, the nitrogen in its tissues is in the form of organic nitrogen, for example amino acids and DNA, which it has used coming from the plants, for example, in case of animals, and used to synthesize these amino acids and DNA. So when they go into the environment, or it is excreted as a waste, it just goes back into the then various fungi and prokaryotes then decompose these tissue and release the inorganic nitrogen back into the ecosystem as ammonia, and this process is termed as ammonification. The ammonia then becomes available for uptake by plants and other organisms, microorganisms, for growth. So this ammonia is then also available for the plant for its growth, and when both of them die, so this is also a smaller kind of a cycle which is going inside the bigger nitrogen cycle, where the excreta or the dead parts of the organisms are acted upon by the decomposer organisms, which can convert it into ammonia molecules by the process termed as ammonification. So this ammonification, again this ammonia generated can be recycled, taken up by the plant protoplasm, or it can be converted into nitrites and nitrates, and by the action of denitrifying bacteria can go back again into the atmosphere. So ammonification also plays an important part, and there are very specialized bacteria doing so. So this is again a nitrogen cycle shown in terms of the reservoir pools and fluxes per year expressed in billions of metric tons. So 10 raised to the power of minus 15 grams of nitrogen per year. That's what it basically shows. So you can see that, various kinds of, so this is the atmosphere over land, this is atmosphere over oceans. So you can see that there are 150 metric, billions of metric tons is basically fixed over the land. And then, and how much is going back? So fixation in the ocean is much more. There is 300 fixation in the ocean that is occurring. And you can see that during the denitrification, 130 billions, same unit is going back. And in this case, the denitrification is causing the 200 units to go back into the atmosphere, so constituting the entire cycle. The atmospheric or solid disposition, which is basically, you can see that in here also the lightning, it is causing the 20 units, billions of metric tons of nitrogen per year. It is also, bringing down and fixing it here, where it comes into the soil, and this soil then they taken up by the organisms, etc. Human sources, the industry, the automobiles, by the burning of fossil, by the fertilizers, or by the burning of fossil fuels, it is also producing and introducing nitrogen into the ecosystem. Some of the nitrogen can run off into the superficial layer, and some of the nitrogen can bury into the sediments deeper down into the oceans. So you can see, and then there is also again a marine cycling which is going on here. So marine cycling, you can see that when it is coming down, it is fixed in the ocean, and there is ocean atmosphere exchange that occurs. So there is a deposition, there is fixation. So these are different, in terms of the, this is just to, visualize that how in terms of the amount of nitrogen that is fixed into the ecosystem and how much amount of nitrogen is returned into the atmosphere. So you can see that these are the reservoir pools, and this is where basically the actually nutrient cycling is occurring. So this is the labile pool or the exchange pool which is there. So that is basically the global nitrogen cycle depicting these values. As I said, when we talk about this nitrogen cycle, this was a normal nitrogen cycle we were looking at, but looking at the numbers, we also saw that there are lots of sources of nitrogen. More and more nitrogen is introduced into the ecosystem. For example, by the human activities, the production of nitrogen fertilization, the application of nitrogen fertilization, various effluents of industries, etc. They are again introducing a lot of nitrogen into the ecosystem. And when there is too much of nitrogen in the ecosystem, then it becomes detrimental. And various effects, the burning of fossil fuels, the application of nitrogen-based fertilizers and other activities can dramatically increase the amount of biologically available nitrogen to the in an ecosystem. Industrial nitrogen fixation has increased exponentially since 1940s, and human activity has doubled the amount of global nitrogen fixation, and that is a number, again some 20 years back, which is 1997. So now you can imagine that how much more nitrogen has been introduced into the ecosystem. And this too much nitrogen is having many deleterious effects. In terrestrial ecosystem, for example, the addition of nitrogen can lead to nutrient imbalance in trees, changes in the forest health, and decline in the biodiversity. Much of the nitrogen applied to agricultural and urban areas ultimately enters the rivers and near-shore coastal systems. In near-shore marine systems, increase in nitrogen can often lead to anoxia or no oxygen or low oxygen conditions or hypoxia, therefore altering the biodiversity, changes in the food web structure, and general habitat degradation. So when all the organisms, the animals, birds, microorganisms, they are affected, then obviously the humans are affected too. So too much of nitrogen is actually creating very harmful and toxic effects on all the strata of an ecosystem, and therefore it's very important to keep a balance of the nutrients so that they can be cycled properly. One common consequence of this increased nitrogen is an increase in harmful algal blooms. The toxic blooms of certain types of dinoflagellates have been associated with high fish and shellfish mortality in some areas. So because of the increase in the nitrogen, the process which is also termed as eutrophication, when there is an accumulation of a particular nutrient, and as we saw these nitrogen then washes off into the rivers, etc., the higher nitrogen conditions leads to the increase in in certain kind of organisms such as the dinoflagellates. And these algal blooms, as can be seen in this picture, this is the bloom of the toxic non-nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria microcystis species in eutrophic Lake Tai in China. So you can see the entire green area has come up. So this is the algal bloom which has covered the entire lake. And because of the presence of this organism, all the biodiversity of the lake and the habitat of the other organisms have been very much affected. So this accumulation of a particular nutrient, which is called as the eutrophication, based upon the human activities, is causing a lot of imbalance and destruction into the biodiversity. So again, these points need to be considered, that how to combat so that a balance is maintained for the nutrients so that they can be cycled properly, and we are not putting too much of a load on any organism of this or any component of this cycle so that a disbalance occurs. So that is that is why this detrimental was discussed here. So this was all about the nitrogen cycling, which is a very important, and as we said, it is complex because it has many nitrogen forms. Nitrogen exists in many different forms in the ecosystem, and therefore it needs many specialized bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria, the ammonifying bacteria, microorganisms, that can fix the nitrogen, the atmospheric nitrogen, brings it into the biotic part of the ecosystem, and then again certain type of specialized organisms, which are the denitrifying organisms, which can return these back to the atmosphere. We come to the next element, which is the cycling of phosphorus. Now phosphorus cycle is simpler, as phosphorus occurs in a few chemical forms as compared to the nitrogen. So we can see here, if we look at this is the cycling of the phosphorus. Now this is a sedimentary type of cycle. Sedimentary because the reservoir pool is actually in the sediments. This phosphate rocks is the reservoir pool for the cycling of the phosphorus. The phosphorus also forms a part of the protoplasm, and therefore the plants and the animals and the bacteria, they need this phosphorus for the synthesis. Many of the amino acids need phosphorus. So this phosphorus is needed in here, which is then taken up or converted into the dissolved phosphate form. So usually this dissolved phosphate form is what is used by the plants for the protoplasm synthesis. And obviously it goes to the animals which feed upon these plants and utilize this phosphorus to for their protoplasm synthesis, for other wherever it is required in the organism. And again there is a smaller cycling where the bacteria can take up, and then from the animals or the plants, when they die, then it comes to certain bacteria, and they have the tendency to give back these dissolved phosphates. The major form of dissolved phosphate is generated by these deposits. So the phosphate, so this is the reservoir pool which is in the sediments, the guano deposits, the fossil bone deposits, or the volcanic apatite which is there. So all these kind of phosphate accumulation, by these erosion or various activities, they become the dissolved phosphates, and then they can be converted into this form. The dissolved phosphates can lead to the shallow marine sediments or the apatite formation, and some of them can move to the or lost to the deep sediments. So the shallow sediments are important, where it can be encountered by the marine birds and fishes, and they can return these dissolved phosphates into as the phosphate rocks. Also, although they do return these dissolved phosphates from the shallow marine sediments to this reservoir pool, but they do not form a major component as it is always assumed to be. So they do it, but it's not a major form of returning them into the phosphate rocks. They can by themselves again deposit and create these kind of formations. The animals can die, and through their excretion, this is again become a cycle, the dissolved phosphates can come into these forms and lead to the small sediments, etc. So this is how the phosphorus, so it is simpler because there is only dissolved phosphate forms which we can see. So the phosphate rocks and the dissolved phosphate forms, and whatever is present in the protoplasm of the plants and animals. So less different forms are there. It is a self-regulated, it is less well-regulated material which is there, and it is a sedimentary type of a phosphorus cycle which is there. Looking again at the values, because that makes us recognize the importance of these nutrients and the importance and how an imbalance is created. This is the global phosphorus cycle depicting the reservoir pools of and fluxes expressed in units of 10 raised to the power of minus 12 gram phosphorus per year. So you can see that from this area, so this is the mining part. So again the phosphorus, a lot of phosphorus has been removed from these phosphate rocks and sediments. So it is said that, it's not exhaustive, a lot of sediment is present, but excessive mining is again causing an imbalance and making this cycle less cyclic. So this mining and this mineable rock, you can see that 10,000 of the unit can be mined here, and how much is returning to this part. So this mining is basically, then some of them just flows through and reaches the marine system. Some of them can be lost to the deep sediments. However, some of them remains as the shallow sediments and can be deposited into the organisms lying there. It can also leach to the soils, and from the soils, from the sediment and all the soil, these plants can take up. This is the internal cycling which is occurring. So the plants die and the phosphorus is returned to the soil, and they can take this up also. Then there is an aerosol or dust transport also, by which this phosphorus can reach the marine thing. So marine sediments, etc., is basically the pool, reservoir pool for these phosphorus cycling, and this is where and these are the numbers by which the phosphorus is circulated in the ecosystem. Now, an important aspect to note here is the interaction of the nitrogen and phosphorus. It is especially worthy of attention. The N/P ratio in average biomass is 16:1, and in rivers and streams about 28:1. So this ratio needs to be maintained. So one of the, Schindler in 1977, he applied a balancing the ratio between the nitrogen phosphorus fertilizer repeatedly into a lake ecosystem. And he found that, he has hypothesized that lake ecosystems have evolved natural mechanisms to compensate the deficits of nitrogen and carbon, but not for the deficits of phosphorus, which does not have a gaseous phase. So what he did was, he created this ratio of N/P, the balanced different ratios of N/P, and applied it to the lake ecosystem, and he could observe that where there was a, if the N/P ratio had fallen below 5, then the nitrogen accumulating and fixation, bacteria, etc., these microorganisms thrived. They increased in number so that they could fix more of nitrogen into the lake ecosystem. So they could compensate for the deficit that was created, because now the N/P ratio was 5, and ideally, as we can see, it is 28:1. So these organisms, the growth of these organisms could compensate the deficit of the nitrogen and carbon. However, if the N/P ratio is creating a deficit of phosphorus, then no such development or growth take place. So because primarily it does not have a gaseous phase. So accordingly, the primary production in freshwater systems is very often correlated with the available phosphorus. So if there is more phosphorus, there will be more productivity. So depending upon this N/P ratio and the availability of phosphorus, because if there is a deficit of phosphorus, the productivity is going to go down. If there is an excess of phosphorus, then again the productivity is need to be go down. There has to be a balance. There has to be so it becomes very important that this phosphorus cycle is also very important. And because of this excessive mining, although we have a very huge reservoir pool and it is not ending very soon, but still, because of this excessive mining, this is becoming much less cyclic, because it needs to be returned back to the sediments. And returning back to the sediments, the amount it is going and the time it is taking, the excessive mining should also be stopped for a proper balance to take place. So that's what is about the cycling of phosphorus. Coming to the third and last cycle, which is the cycling of sulfur molecule. As I said, we have taken this sulfur cycling because it is very illustrative of the interaction of the cycling between all the three strata, the air, water and the atmosphere. So all the air, water and land. So the circulation is involving all the three components of the ecosystem. As well as we will also look at that when the sulfur is cycling, it is also affecting the another nutrient cycle. So the interaction between these nutrient cycling, we will observe, and we will also see the impact of human activities, that again how this cycling, like we saw it for the nitrogen, that too much of nitrogen is detrimental. We will also see that how this air pollution or the excessive sulfur in the air, how that is affecting this sulfur cycling and how it is detrimental for the ecosystem development. Now sulfate as nitrate, etc. So the sulfate is the principal biological available form that is reduced by autotrophs and is incorporated into the proteins. Sulfur being an essential constituent of certain amino acids. So again, sulfur becomes an essential nutrient, and the principal biological form is sulfate, which needs to be absorbed by the plants and then can be incorporated into proteins. These plants, when eaten by the heterotrophs, these sulfur can pass on to them and therefore can again incorporate into their protoplasm by the synthesis of these different proteins, etc. Now, not as much sulfur is required by the ecosystem as nitrogen and phosphorus, and nor is sulfur as often a limiting factor for the growth of plant and animals. Nevertheless, sulfur cycle is key one in the general pattern of production and decomposition. So, as I have already stated that although neither the sulfur is limiting nor the sulfur is as essential as nitrogen and phosphorus, the study of this cycle is again very important because of the general pattern of the production and decomposition. And another particular important aspect is how one nutrient cycle will regulate another. For example, when iron sulfides are formed in sediments, when iron sulfides are formed in sediments, the phosphate is converted from insoluble to a soluble form and thus enters the pool available to the living organism. So the fixation of the sulfur molecules, the formation of the iron sulfides in the sediment is also triggering the phosphorus cycle, because the phosphorus then converts into a soluble form and enters into the ecosystem. So the two cycles interact together, and one cycling is affecting the cycling of the other nutrient also. So this is again very much reflected in the cycling of the sulfur molecules which is there. So we will look in this case at first the estimates of the amount of sulfur in the reservoir pools. So the reservoir pools for sulfur is the lithosphere, atmosphere and oceans, and the annual fluxes in and out of these pools, including inputs and outputs directly related to the human activities. So we will look deeper into this particular diagram and look at the figures. So this is the lithosphere part, the pyrite part, where it is accumulated as iron sulfide, etc. And you can see this is the so 10 raised to the power of, so this is the reservoir pool for that. So this is 10 raised to the power of 10 tetragram. Here Tg is, we are talking about the tetragram of sulfur per year. So you can see that this acts as the reservoir pool which is there, and then there are other molecules. So then these molecules can again, the sulfur can be converted, and this is the atmospheric pool. So we also have the sulfur which is present in the atmosphere. So this is the atmosphere pool which is around 5 tetragram, and you can see that they can be deposited again here and returning back by the fossil by the volcanic eruptions, and this is only 5 and the 8 units to the atmosphere. This uptake by the plants and animals converts these, and we will see how different microorganisms act on these sulfide pools and convert them into gases such as hydrogen sulfide, and again it goes back into the environment. So this is how it is going into the environment, but some of them then leaches and goes into the oceanic pool, goes into the rivers. The third pool, reservoir pool, lies at the ocean. So sulfur cycle has 3 pools: the land pool, lithosphere pool, the atmosphere pool, and the ocean pool. In the ocean pool, you can see that it is circulating by the deposition at the ocean land, etc., by the conversion into pyrites and the hypothermal sulfides. They can also be again returned back in the form of aerosols, and then this is the transport to sea and transport to land also that is occurring. So there is circulation of sulfur between the 3 pools. They can be going from one pool to the another, and the cycling thing is also happening. So, and you can see the numbers which can tell us about how much of sulfur is coming into the ecosystem from these pools, circulating. So again, the human activities have also been included. So the human activities causes around 90 tetragram of sulfur per year to go back into the atmosphere. Human activities cause these some of the sulfur to go back into the to leach out into the rivers. So a lot of these things are happening, and this is the numbers which depicts how the sulfur is circulating. There are specialized sulfur bacteria which function like a relay team in cycling of sulfur in soils, fresh water, and wetlands. So we have seen that these are the 3 major pools which are there, and these specialized bacteria. So this diagram basically represents that how this hydrogen sulfide then can be accumulated in as deposited in the form of iron sulfide sediments as the pyrite or the black anaerobic mud. So this is the rapidly cycling biologically available pool in water and shallow sediments, and this is deposition in the deep sediments, very slowly fluxing reservoir pool. So here we are just looking at the reservoir pool, only one of the systems. We are not considering the lithosphere here. We are just considering the marine ecosystem, the fresh water and the wetlands ecosystem which is here, that how it is circulating. So you can see that there are different steps which are mentioned here. So step 1 is the primary production by plants. So they take up these sulfates and they generate this biomass, the organic sulfate. So this is the primary production by plants. Now the step 2, 3, 6, 4, 5, 6 and 7. These are the steps which are carried out by different organisms. Step 2, for example, is carried out by the decomposition by heterotrophic microorganisms. So when the plants die, this organic matter comes into the soil, or and then they are acted upon by these decomposing bacteria. These decomposing bacteria release these organic sulfate in the formation of hydrogen sulfide. So the H2S is released. Number 3 is in the form of animal secretion. So this biomass that is generated by plants and in some food chain is passed on to the animals. Then the animal excreta, they can release back this sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, or the sulfate into the atmosphere. 4 and 5 represents the colorless green and purple sulfur bacteria. So they take this hydrogen sulfide, they utilize this hydrogen sulfides and synthesize the sulfur, which can then be converted into sulfate again. So the 4 and 5 are the colorless green and purple sulfur bacteria, which has the ability to convert hydrogen sulfide into sulfates. 6 is the anaerobic sulfur reducing bacteria or D-sulfovibrio. So D-sulfovibrio and the bacteria such as Thiobacillus, they have the capacity to take directly the sulfate converted into hydrogen sulfide. So D-sulfovibrio converts the sulfate into hydrogen sulfide, and Thiobacillus is sulfide oxidizing, so they convert hydrogen sulfide into sulfate. So all these different organisms, the purple bacteria, the sulfur dioxide oxidizing bacteria or the sulfur reducing bacteria, all these bacteria convert this sulfate into hydrogen sulfide and back into sulfate. So, that is how they cycle this bacteria into those. So as we can see, this is a rapidly cycling biologically available pool in water and shallow sediments where this cycling is taking place. Step 8, which is mentioned here, is the phosphorus, what we talked about. It represents the conversion of phosphorus from an unavailable to an available form when iron sulfides are formed. So this is the available pool where the major recycling is taking place, and the important components are these microorganisms and organisms and plants and animals which are cycling it through this pool. This hydrogen sulfide can also be converted and deposited into deep sediments in the form of iron sulfide. And this conversion causes the phosphorus to be converted into an soluble form. And therefore, this part affects another nutrient recycling also. And therefore, this is also, so this becomes the second reservoir pool which is here. Basically, the sediments, the deeper sediments of the oceans which is there. So this very clearly represents the cyclic nature of the sulfur, that how this sulfur is nutrient is cycled through the ecosystem, and also emphasize on the fact that how two nutrient cycles can be impacting each other. For example, the conversion of sulfur into iron sulfide triggers the phosphorus to be converted into a soluble form and enter into the phosphorus cycling thing. The microbial driven process in deep anaerobic zones in soils and sediments results from the upward movement of gaseous hydrogen sulfide in land and wetland ecosystems, as we have just seen. The decomposition of proteins also leads to this production of H2S. Once in the atmosphere, this gaseous phase is converted to other forms, principally sulfur dioxide, sulfate and sulfur aerosols. Aerosols are very fine particles of sulfur dioxide, so sulfate molecules. So this H2S can then be rapidly converted into these sulfur forms, different forms. As we saw that there is detrimental effect of too much of nitrogen, there is a too much of detrimental effect of the too much of sulfur. The gaseous oxides of sulfur, like that of nitrogen, are toxic to varying degrees. Sulfur dioxide is damaging to photosynthesis. There are evidences which shows that if there is too much of sulfur present, then it is detrimental for the leaf growth and for the growth of the plants and for the photosynthetic process to take place. Furthermore, sulfur, just like nitric oxides, interact with water vapor to produce the droplets of dilute sulfuric and nitric acid that fall to the earth as acid rain. So this acid rain is a very important, very air pollution, effect of air pollution. So if sulfur dioxide, too much of sulfur dioxide is there in the environment, it combines with the water molecules to give rise to the H2SO4, which is an acid. This acid is then falling onto the earth, and this acid rain has greatest impact on soft water lakes or streams and already acidic soils that lack pH buffers such as the carbonates, calcium salts and other bases. So if there is too much of a sulfur in the atmosphere, or too much of a sulfur in the lakes and oceans, or too much of the sulfur in the land where the plants are growing, then it is again very much detrimental effect which is there. So we need to study about the nutrient cycling, how it circulates into the ecosystem, and based upon the values which are which are normal for a sulfur or whatever organisms are present that they can cycle these nutrients into the ecosystem, if too much of load because of human activities is given onto them, that it becomes very much detrimental. So we need to study these nutrient cycle in correlation with the pollution and the detrimental effects so that they can be maintained in a very balanced manner. So we take up the carbon and hydrologic cycle in our next lecture. That will be all.
With this note, thank you, and thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.caec@nic.in if you have any question or if you wish to give your feedback. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon. Thank you for watching CC Gurukul Live Lectures. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.